a lot of information to get through. So I just want to make sure that we get through everything. We are going to have a question and answer portion at the end of the panel, but please feel free to ask a question. There's at the bottom of your screen, you can see there's a Q&A. Please feel free to write any questions in there. There is a chat, so if you can't see the question and answer, please feel free to do the chat, but we would prefer the question and answer box if possible. And anything we don't get to, you can email myself or Sophia, and we'll make sure that we get you the answers. So, welcome. I'm really excited to facilitate this panel. My name is Jacqueline Hubbard. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Communications at NAMI, Massachusetts. We're seeing reduced investment, workforce strain, and in some cases, challenges to the very idea of community integration. What's at risk here isn't just funding streams or program models. It's people's ability to live in their communities, to exercise choice, and to have their rights respected. At the same time, we've fought hard for decades to move away from institutional models and towards community-based care. Those gains didn't happen by accident. They were built through advocacy, litigation, and lived experience leadership. Today's conversation isn't just about naming challenges. It's about what we can do in response, how we advocate, how we protect what's working, and how we keep moving forward, even if the progress feels uncertain. I've had the privilege of working closely with our panelists today, and I can say firsthand that their depth of experience, expertise, and commitment to this work is extraordinary. We're fortunate to have perspectives that span enforcement, litigation, and lived experience. From Ann Lynch's work on civil rights enforcement to Stephen Swartz's national litigation efforts to Keith Scott's leadership in peer support and human rights within services. We're truly honored to host a panel with such impactful advocates in the disability space. We're thankful for all that they do in their time today. With that, I would like to have the panelists introduce themselves, and I will start with Ann.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Lynch. I am an Assistant Attorney General at A.G. Campbell's Attorney General's Office in Massachusetts. I also serve as the office's Disability Rights Coordinator, and I also want to say I'm honored to be on this panel with these incredible advocates. I've been at the Attorney General's office for 15 years now. The first 10, I did civil rights and consumer protection work. But for the last 5, I've been shifting to do just civil rights enforcement work and increasingly focusing on disability rights work. In the Civil Rights Division at the Attorney General's office, we can do employment cases, housing, education, law enforcement accountability cases, public accommodations cases, and we can also obtain injunctions in cases of civil rights violations, what we might colloquially call hate crimes situations. My work is mostly focused on combating discrimination in housing and public accommodations, but I also help develop our office's strategic litigation, legislative priorities, and guidance when it relates to disability rights.
Thank you. Stephen?
Hi, thanks for everybody for being here. My name is Stephen Schwartz. I'm the special counsel at the Center for Public Representation. We're a public interest law firm that assists people with disabilities locally in Massachusetts and across the country. We've done systemic advocacy for decades, worked closely with Attorney General Campbell and her predecessor, now Governor Healy. It's really been an honor in these tough days to be able to partner with the Attorney General's office. Often we're on the other side of cases, but this one we're fighting for the same goals, keeping people with disabilities at home in their communities safe and fed and able to do the things that everyone wants to do. So thanks very much for having us.
Thank you. And Keith?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Scott. I'm the Vice President of Peer Support and Self-Advocacy at a private nonprofit human service agency called Advocates based in Framingham. I've been with Advocates for 37 years, hired back in 1989 as a person with lived experience to provide peer support in a brand new group home that Advocates was opening for gentlemen coming out of Westboro State Hospital. And over the last 37 years, I've held a variety of different positions, some even clinical positions, although I've always worked from the perspective of lived experience. What would I want for services? How would I want to be treated and spoken to? And I feel very fortunate to have been invited here today. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I'm really excited. So let's dive in. I want to start with what's at stake right now. What are the most urgent threats to community-based services, and where are we seeing backsliding on rights or access? Anne, I'll start with you.
Okay, so to answer this question, I really tried to think about trends, which we could also call threats. And my insights on this front are really determined by the day-to-day work that I do. So anecdotally, when it comes to civil rights enforcement in Massachusetts, what I am seeing could be boiled down to increased resistance to enforcement and decreased resources for enforcement. So, for example, it seems that individuals and entities that are accused of discrimination are essentially just putting up more of a fight. More of our enforcement actions are going to litigation, and more of our litigated cases are hurtling towards a trial rather than finding settlement off ramps. Plus, there's a real sense, at least for me, and I think my colleagues share this, that civil rights laws that we thought were well established and stable are actually not. Instead, they're being challenged in these increased litigious cases, and there is a sense that some of what we think is stable could change. Um, Additionally, there are concerns about potential federal level legal changes. So, for example, HUD recently withdrew what I consider critical guidance on assistance animals for housing providers. And I have noticed, and my colleagues in the office have noticed, that with the withdrawal of this guidance, it's impacted housing providers' behavior towards their tenants, as well as the arguments they're making in our enforcement actions. So increased resistance in the enforcement and obviously demands more resources from offices like mine, and could decrease or decreases resources available to handle other matters. And that's assuming that the available resources is staying the same. They're staying the same. But as I said before, what I'm actually seeing is a decrease in available resources for enforcement. So for example, our local fair housing organizations, which provide free legal representation to people who experience housing discrimination, are experiencing unprecedented financial pressures right now. In Massachusetts, some of these organizations are Mass Fair Housing Project in Holyoke, Community Legal Aid in Worcester, and South Coast Fair Housing in New Bedford. And in the spring of 2025, when DOGE was at the height of its work, many fair housing organizations, including some of these, received letters from the federal government saying that their existing grants were being completely terminated. A coalition of them got together and sued HUD for, again, grant funds that they had already been awarded to do this free legal representation for survivors of discrimination. Our office submitted an amicus brief in that case, discussing the critical nature of these organizations in our state. And ultimately, HUD agreed to restore the existing grants, but we have no idea what will happen when these organizations apply for new grants or seek to continue their services. Similarly, the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, or MCAD, their federal funding has been threatened. For anyone that's here today that doesn't know, the MCAD is our administrative agency that adjudicates discrimination claims based on state law, but it also contracts with federal agencies like HUD and the EEOC to handle federal claims. These administrative agencies are intended to help people pursue their claims without lawyers, in a less formal setting than state trial court. But the federal government announced that they were going to defund any state agencies like the MCAD that enforce state law that went beyond federal protections. So in Massachusetts, our civil rights laws prohibit discrimination based on receipt of public subsidies, like Section 8. and based on gender identity. And neither of those categories are covered by federal law. So, unwilling to walk away from our state law civil rights protections, we recently filed a lawsuit challenging this announcement of defunding. And no, to my knowledge, nothing yet has happened in that case, so stay tuned. Um, so far, I've spoken about state and local resources for civil rights enforcement, but I think it goes without saying that federal resources have also been reduced. So, in preparing for today's panel, I read that in 2025, HUD only charged 4 housing discrimination cases, and it typically charges 35 cases in a year. So, that reflects a drastic reduction in civil rights enforcement. And so I'll just say, ultimately, we were always working with limited resources. It's not like we were ever plush with resources for civil rights enforcement, but now it seems like we have even fewer resources and we're trying to do even more.
Now, with that number of the drastic 35, to 4, does that really then put the onus on places like the AG to step in and kind of try to oversee as many as possible to make sure that all those cases aren't just stalling out?
Yes, our office is trying to continue its robust enforcement of civil rights provisions, but we have always been part of the picture of civil rights
Mhm.
enforcement. There were fair housing organizations, there was federal enforcement, there was state enforcement, and there were private attorneys doing private enforcement. And all together, I'm sure we weren't meeting the need. Um, and it seems like the most stable resource right now from my perspective, is the AG's Office for Enforcement. And so we're trying, but it's not like our funding has multiplied by 5.
Right, right. Thank you. I want to turn over to Stephen now.
So, like Anne said, I think that you can look at the threats in terms of patterns. And I thought about 4 patterns that we see happening these days. One is a direct attack on core disability rights. So, for instance, in the end of the Biden administration, the Department of Health and Human Services enacted an updated, modern version of what's known as the 504 regulation. It's a regulation that is designed to to prevent discrimination and to identify what are forms of discrimination that federally funded agencies need to be aware of. That regulation's been around for 45 years, but it hadn't been updated. So, for instance, the older regulation didn't include anything about the internet, or about kiosks, or about the consequences of the pandemic on healthcare decision making. So the Biden administration updated the regulation. Um, 19 states sued to invalidate the regulation, saying that people with disabilities don't have those rights, that the federal agency doesn't have the authority to identify those rights, and in fact, that the statute that was passed in 1973 that gave the federal agency the authority to enact regulations is itself unconstitutional. So that's one area where states and or the federal government are launching a wholesale attack on disability rights. A second area is reserved to the federal government with the president enacting executive orders. You've heard about a lot of executive orders that President Trump has issued starting on the day of his inauguration. And one of the more recent ones is one that is called the Executive Order on Homelessness, that essentially criminalizes people who are unhoused. It directs the Attorney General to refuse to enter into any agreement with any public entity that allows unhoused people, allows services to be provided to unhoused people, that allows various sorts of um, uh, drug prevention programs to be used on site, that asked the Attorney General to go try to reverse Supreme Court decisions that gave people due process rights, and that suggests that states should create new institutions and lock up people who are unhoused, who are also mentally ill. A third area, so that's a second, executive orders. A third is the one that Anne was talking about earlier, and that's there's a whole range of executive actions that have been designed to eliminate or change basic federal agencies. So, for instance, to wipe out the Department of Education, to change the mission of the Office of Department of Justice's Office of Civil Rights to a mission to from protecting civil rights, protecting voting rights, protecting housing rights, to actually undermining the rights. And also to eliminate federal programs that are designed to provide basic federal benefits, subsistence, food, and other benefits to people regardless of their citizenship status. So, as you know, a wholesale attack on immigrants and non-citizens and anything that the government might do to help them in any way. And the fourth area of a trend is that the federal lawyers, the people who work for the federal government, who are charged with the responsibility to enforce federal laws, have been walking away from the very cases that they started. So, for instance, the Department of Justice brought a case against the state of Maine for failing to provide children who have emotional conditions with home-based services, similar to the case in Massachusetts, some people know as Rosie D. So there was a similar case, and DOJ and the state of Maine finally came to an agreement. The agreement was signed under the Biden administration. As soon as the president took over, the Department of Justice is trying to repudiate the agreement. So the same thing is true in Louisville. They brought a case against the Louisville Police Department for improper and unconstitutional police practices, some that resulted in the murder of Breonna Taylor. They eventually came to an agreement that's called the consent decree. On the day the judge was intended to approve the consent decree, the Department of Justice came in and said, wait a minute, we don't think it was such a good idea. We're going to repudiate the consent decree. We're not going to sign it. And all of the benefits, including many to people with disabilities, were vacated. Fortunately, Louisville has a terrific mayor and who decided that since this was the right thing to do in the first place, even if DOJ was going to walk away, he was going to take this decree, relabel it the People's Consent Decree, and have it enforced by the city, even though there'd be no court involvement. So we can see those four areas: attack on rights, executive orders, defunding and dismantling federal programs, and walking away from federal court orders.
Thank you. I'm thinking about all of them are so important, but the dismantling of programs specifically, I was reading an article today on the continued attack on the Administration for Community Living too, and how that's being dismantled as a whole. That's just directly, scary stuff, especially for those aging and not having those types of support. So thank you for that. And Keith.
Yeah, so I'm not an attorney. So my observations are going to come across as being, fairly obvious to anybody who works in the system. But in terms of the impact on people's services and their quality of lives, kind of what we've been seeing is in part like the perfect convergence of a number of factors that are sort of making the system as ineffective as I've ever seen it in close to 40 years of working directly in the system. One of the obvious contributing factors is the insufficient funding of community-based services. I know this is apparent to everyone. It's really unconscionable to be paying direct support workers $18.50 to $24 an hour, depending on which provider you work for, to take care of the most vulnerable citizens of the Commonwealth. It's unconscionable to put on those shoulders the responsibility for administering 10, 15, up to 20 different medications to 8 different people living in a group home that never asked to live there, that never asked to live with the other 7 people, that never asked to have staff in their living space 24/7, that never asked to have to be expected to follow rules that most citizens of the Commonwealth don't have to follow in their personal lives. Um, there's been a steady decline in the quality of the direct support we're able to provide people because the system has insufficiently funded these services. That's number one. Number two, the landscape, sort of the larger societal landscape, with the current Trump administration and, threats to organizations if they don't bend the knee around removing all references to diversity, equity, and inclusion, those kinds of things, people that we support who identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, particularly those who identify as being trans, I feel under attack, no longer seen, no longer heard, and they fear for their safety, quite frankly, because of these policies. Um, you know, the system services are currently overwhelmed because of cuts to other services and peripheral services. So we've seen, in the programs that we operate to assist people 24/7 around crisis support, we've seen a large influx of people from the shelter system who are being turned away from shelters, who don't have the same access to places to stay, particularly during the winter months, showing up and needing help. And then this kind of bizarre thing that happens with people like me who should sort of know better. We start like trying to parse out which people we're now responsible for helping. Like, do they fall into they're unhoused, but they're not really in psychiatric crisis? And I don't know how you're not in a psychiatric crisis if you're not unhoused, as someone who's been unhoused for periods of time myself. And so then we start, basically controlling how the services are provided and doling them out in small amounts. And it's insufficient. We're not able to see people as often as we used to be able to see people. We're not spending the amount of time with people that we used to be able to spend. And as a result, those folks start to suffer. And then that manifests in things that occur out in the community, like violence, that then gets attributed to just, mental illness rather than a dearth of services and supports for a person who was doing well while they had services and supports, but who, once they started to be ignored, once those services weren't as responsive as they had been in the past, really began to have a difficult time, which resulted in a tragedy. And we've seen a number of those tragedies recently. And I think they're all attributable to the fact that we're not able to hire the best staff to provide support to people because we don't pay a high enough rate. We don't seem to value that service. And the folks living in our group homes and in our programs that are served by outreach staff, they don't have a lot of opportunities to interact in the community. They're not able to get out in the community and try things and make mistakes and pick themselves up with support. That stuff doesn't happen. Transportation is very difficult to provide for provider organizations like Advocates. We serve a huge geography, and the ability to provide transportation for people to get to where they want to go just isn't there. So all of that impacts on their sort of general quality of life in ways that sort of continue to deteriorate over time. And the efforts that are being made to advocate on the behalf of the staff to have increased wages so that they can live on one job instead of 2 or 3, we put that responsibility on their backs as well. So we try to, we organize attendance at, caring force rallies. So we ask our staff to go and advocate for themselves to get pay raises. So that's, I think that's the most daunting aspect of all of this is how do we, and there's a lack of willingness to be creative and flexible with the existing resources. So even if we said we don't want more money, we would like to work with our state agency partners to use existing resources in a more creative and flexible way. We operate group homes that are staffed with 8.75 FTEs, every single one of them, as though every one of those 8 people living in every one of those 105 group homes is exactly the same person with exactly the same challenges. That's not the case. We can certainly work to pull overnights out of programs because we have adults who are capable of sleeping through the night and calling 911 if there's an emergency, but there's no flexibility allowed in the contracts. And so we have to do what we're told to do, and we're not able to. Deaf services, for example, is not treated as a specialty program. For years, we staffed deaf group homes with hearing staff. Make a whole lot of sense in terms of access to support. So, like all of these things can be sort of, attributable to the lack of financial support for these services, combined with a tenor in the environment that is inhospitable to people with disabilities, is inhospitable to people who are just generally different. And there's just a lot of fear around that.
Thank you. You started with talking about the impact, and I really think that's a great transition. I want to talk about the impact. So, how do these challenges show up in people's daily lives, and what happens to people when systems fail? I think it's so important to cover, so thank you for that. And I'd love if we could dive into that question. Anne, circle back to you.
So to address this segment of the panel, I really tried to look at the data my office has access to on what people are reporting to our office. And this is largely folks who are living independently in the community, the complaints that we get. And I also want to say our data is not scientific. It is a representative sample of the people who make their way to the AG's office to file a complaint, which is likely not a truly representative sample. But we do look at it for trends, and we can compare it to other data sources. And I do think it provides some insight. So historically, the Attorney General's office has always received a ton of discrimination complaints based on disability. Since I've been here, we didn't check data this far back, but I believe it's been our largest discrimination protected category. And that continues to be the case, but I'll just break it down a little bit. So in the housing context, and we all know that there's an affordable, accessible housing crisis in this state and in this country. In the housing context, we're seeing growth actually in the number of disability-based discrimination complaints. So in 2024, it was 20%, 2025, it was 28%, and so far in 2026, it's up to 34%. For comparison purposes, our next most common protected category is source of income. And the highest that has gotten is 26% this year. Previously, it was 16% in 2024 and 13% in 2025. So disability complaints far outnumber even source of income complaints, which is a huge and terrible problem in our marketplace. In the public accommodations context, I was actually surprised by this. We've seen a slight drop in disability-based complaints. And that may be for other reasons, which we'll get to. But in 2024, 37% of our public accommodations complaints related to disability. In 2025, it was down to 30. And so far this year, we're at 26%. Still, by far, disability is still our highest category for public accommodations complaints. But this year, I'll note that the next highest categories are race at 20% and gender identity at 17%. And so I think what may be happening here is the disability percentages are going down, not because disability is increasing, but we're seeing an increase in discrimination based on LGBTQIA identities and race and national origin. And so the percentages are adjusting because of that. In the employment context, we're also seeing growth and disability based complaints. 2024, we had 21% were disability. 2025, it was 22, and 2026 to date, it's 35. Again, our largest protected category in the employment context. The MCAD reports very similar data. I wasn't able to access data based on location, so I can't break this down by employment, housing, or public accommodations. But in 2023, 20.9% of all MCAD complaints related to disability. In 2024, it was up to 21.3, and in 2025, up to 21.9. So that seems quite consistent with what we're seeing. All this to say that disability complaints really have dominated our civil rights complaints in recent years, and it seems to be a trend that's only going to continue. Additionally, anecdotally, I'll say a big chunk of our disability discrimination cases relate to reasonable accommodations, whether this is a service animal at a public accommodation, whether this is maybe a work from home or an alternate schedule in an employment setting, or we see a huge number of complaints in the mental health context around emotional support animals and housing. And again, this relates to affordable, accessible housing and pet restrictions and how hard it is to find apartments right now. Additionally, I just want to note that a newer set of complaints we're seeing has to do with a lot of threats by housing providers, some employers, but we're seeing a lot of housing providers threaten to call ICE as a way to evict tenants. And while this implicates obviously national origin discrimination, there are people with disabilities in every category, every other category. So, when we are seeing public accommodations discrimination based on race, those individuals could also have a disability. So.
And I was going to ask, when you talk about source of income, they could also be individuals with disabilities too. So do you track that as well? So the number, in theory, could also be higher for the individuals who have
I wish I had the statistics on me right now. Keith might know this, but a huge percentage of folks who receive housing subsidies do have disabilities. It's a great way to get folks community housing with a housing subsidy.
Thank you. Steve.
I think the biggest impact is actually characterized by the fact that there's nobody home in Washington, D.C. who really cares about us. The people who are working there have a very different agenda. And it's not about the kind of things that Keith talked about, whether it's workers' pay or living arrangements or discrimination. It's all about locking folks up, getting them off the street. They don't want us near them. And it's the us, them that is characterizing the attitude in Washington. And it's about there's a lot of thems. It's not only people with disability, it's non-citizens, it's people with gender identity, it's people from Iran. But whatever the them is, I mean, we are like all of them, but it is not the people in Washington who care about us. So, for instance, in December of 2024, there's 5 divisions within the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, or 5 sections: housing, voting, police, ADA, and facilities. In total, there were about 300 lawyers, many of whom had worked from the time they got out of law school or a few years thereafter. They were career lawyers. They were real smart. They cared a lot. They brought a lot of different cases. They dealt with complaints on the federal level that Ann was talking about that occur on the state level. And they were there for us. And they were there for people with disabilities. Of those 300 people, there's less than 49 today who are still standing in that. They've all gone to either no jobs or other jobs. Actually, some have gone to attorney generals. They're working with in the civil rights section in the Attorney General Campbell's office. There's the police section, hired one of the best lawyers from the Department of Justice, others working for attorney generals in Connecticut and New York and Maryland and Delaware, et cetera. So, but they're not working in Washington for us. A second, a second point is that in most federal agencies, there was something called the Office of Civil Rights. They would receive complaints about civil rights violations by their agency. The Department of Transportation had one that would take complaints from people who got on an airplane and there wasn't a wheelchair to help them get off, or there wasn't an accessible communication device that would allow them to buy their tickets or talk to someone at the airport. The Office of Civil Rights at most agencies have either been eliminated or they have been essentially just decimated. There almost are no lawyers working for civil rights in the various agencies that are all about our rights: education, health and human services, transportation, the Department of Labor. And finally, the focus of a lot of those agencies have shifted from promoting independence to ensuring institutionalization. ACL, the Administration on Community Living that Jacqueline mentioned a little while ago, previously were supporting grants and disability organizations to think about alternatives to guardianship. CPR, where I work, was one of them that was working with a number of other entities in Massachusetts, community organizations, to look at supported decision making as an alternative to guardianship. Now, the Department of Justice has made a deal with the Veterans Administration to be able to deputize people from the Veterans Administration so they can go into court in Massachusetts, get guardianships over unhoused or mentally ill veterans, and put them away. So instead of promoting alternatives to guardianship that emphasize autonomy, choice, self-determination, we have a government that's thinking about limiting where you live, what you can decide, when you can vote, and what services you're able to get. So I think the impact is really driven by a view in Washington that we are other. We are not like them. And because we are other, we are less deserving. We are the objects of punitive actions, and we are not going to be protected, which means that on a state level, the attorney generals like Attorney General Campbell and Attorney Generals in New York and California, Washington, and many other states are our best public protectors, maybe for the time being, our only public protectors. But that also is a challenge to us because it means that organizations like mine, public interest organizations, have to step up. Self-advocates like Keith have to step up and be able to organize in a way or bring our own cases in court, not depend on the federal government to protect us. In fact, we're going to need to protect ourselves against the federal government.
I just want to make a point too. I worked for the United States Senate actually, and those attorneys with the DOJ, the Office of Civil Rights staff, it wasn't just that them in and of themselves are so important, but that's their job. They're not appointed. They are through multiple different administrations doing this job. And there is a loss of knowledge that we don't talk about of the history, the expertise, the experience that these people have had working within these systems gone, wiped out in a way that I don't know how we get that back ever. And that is a huge loss to every system that we have. And I think people who aren't in it maybe don't understand. This is not something that was just an appointment. These don't switch out every 4 years. These are lifetime staffers that have been through Republican and Democratic administrations and are really there for the law and for the service of the work. And so it's heartbreaking to see how much we're losing with their departures. Keith, I'd love to round it back to you. You started this impact discussion.
Yes, so in terms of the impact on people who receive services, this issue with sort of the quality of staffing, um, hiring enough staff. We run vacancies all the time. Many of the staff people that we employ are eligible for the same entitlement benefits that many of the people we serve are eligible for. That's a fundamental problem. We have staff people who live in their cars. How is that acceptable? I mean, right? So these are the folks who are supposed to be in position to be able to support the people with disabilities in group homes, in outreach settings, in day treatment programs, et cetera, et cetera. And their plates are full just trying to manage the quality of their own lives because they're struggling, working multiple jobs, not being able to pay bills. At 18.50, 19, $20 an hour, just your rental cost eats up about half to two-thirds of your gross income. That doesn't leave a lot for anything else like bills or groceries. So we have this situation where many of the staff we employ need the same kinds of supports that the people we are charged to serve need. And because of that, they're not able to provide all of the support in these locations, in these group homes. And so what you end up with are people just aren't getting what they need. The staff aren't getting what they need to be able to do their jobs properly. And the folks who depend on them for support and service, transportation, compassion, those folks are dealing with a lot of other issues that make them relatively unavailable to people. And so folks have either started to abdicate almost all responsibility for their lives, like they just sort of give up, right? And we're every day, every week in these programs with members of the peer support team, trying to kind of inspire people to keep putting one foot in front of the other. But it's a real challenge given what people are experiencing. And the wherewithal of the staff that are supposed to be the ones who are inspiring and supporting and walking alongside folks. The other way this goes is people begin to sort of act out because they're angry and they're frustrated, understandably so. And then the way that we respond to that, because we don't have adequate supports in place for people, is we respond with more control. Section 12 is getting people to the ED, restrictive plans for people in the program, asserting that people can't leave their group home unless they're accompanied by a staff person, doing things like locking up knives and sharps in programs. Like these are the things that we do in response to situations that we feel are somewhat chaotic or somewhat dangerous and unsafe. And the people who ultimately always pay the price for that are the people who are the most vulnerable in this equation. And those are the folks that we're paid to serve and support. So it's a real challenge to be trying to do this work, support the staff who desperately need it, and we know that they're up against it, while at the same time responding to the concerns and complaints of the people who aren't getting what they need, who are filing complaints on those very same staff. So, we've got to find a way out of this cycle. And again, I'm not all that optimistic about, increases in funding. I do feel like it's a reasonable request to have a conversation about utilizing existing resources more flexibly, particularly as we kind of see ways in which we could do that effectively and have done it effectively in the past. So the big effort here really, like on the ground and in the programs, is to continue to encourage people to speak up for themselves, to encourage them to continue to file human rights complaints where they feel like their rights are being violated or abrogated or circumvented in some way. And for us to continue to kind of look into those matters as enthusiastically as we can to come to some sort of arrangement with people around kind of what they want and what they need when they're not getting it from our services. So it's a real challenge.
and we're all feeling it, right? Like the way the world is right now, we're talking very specifically about in the disability space and the mental health space, but we're all feeling it. There's so many issues going on right now, and especially with individuals' economic status and what jobs we have and all of that. It would be a bit naive of us to say, well, no, 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 don't worry about that. You'll be fine. You need to still step up and show up and do your job. We need to really care for everyone who's caring for our loved ones and who's for caring for our siblings, our children, our brothers, our sisters, our aunts, uncles, anyone. So that's a really important point, Keith. I'd love to cover in the next section of our time protecting past gains. And so, how do we defend the progress that's already been made? We've kind of gotten into what's at stake and what the impact is, but how do we protect the things that we do have, all of the work that we've done over the last 40, 50 years? Anne, I'd love to start with you.
So again, speaking from the state perspective, the Attorney General's office is really actively engaged in litigation and other activities to deal with federal actions that we believe are unlawful and harmful to our residents. This is the work you'll see in the news, in the press releases. It's incredibly important. One example that's relevant to your constituents is a case we brought to protect mental health grants. These grants were created by congressional appropriation after the school shooting in Uvalde, and the intent was to place 14,000 mental health professionals across the country in schools, especially schools that were low income or in rural areas that might not have counselors on staff. In April 2025, the Department of Education announced that these grants were being completely discontinued, and our office went to court to protect the money that had literally already been awarded to grantees in the Commonwealth. In December, the court determined that the Department of Education had acted unlawfully, and it ordered the Department of Education to make lawful decisions regarding the funding of each individual grant going forward. But since that order, there have been several instances of asserted potential noncompliance. And despite the court's order this last March, the Department of Education deviated from its normal funding and only issued 6-month funding decisions versus year funding decisions on grants. So our office is back in court asking the judge to enforce the court order requiring that these grants be given to the awardees so that mental health professionals can be in schools where they need to be. This is very reflective of everything that everyone on the panel has said before about what's happening. But in addition to the federal litigation, we're also, and we kind of touched on this earlier, I think equally important and less publicized is we're really trying to continue to robustly grow our civil rights enforcement. I will say between 2016 and 2020, there was so much going on that I don't have the numbers, but I think there were fewer resources to core civil rights enforcement in our office because we were covering all of this federal work. But we've been more prepared this time around. We have a special division that's devoted to this work, although civil rights division attorneys are still working on these cases. And that has enabled us to continue the actual mission of our day-to-day work, which is, combating housing discrimination so people with disabilities can have apartments and use their Section 8 vouchers. So we're also trying to increase our strategic litigation efforts and do more impact litigation in addition to our core enforcement. We're trying to put out guidance that addresses both new questions that have come up and fills in where we've lost federal guidance. So we just actually revised guidance that we issued last year on it's our Know Your Rights regarding ICE enforcement guidance. And specifically, one revision we made this year was reminding everyone that they have a right to accessible facilities and reasonable accommodations when they encounter federal officers. Um, and through all this work, we're trying to really send a consistent message that the law in Massachusetts has not changed. So I mentioned earlier that HUD withdrew this critical assistance animal guidance for housing providers. But that doesn't mean the law in Massachusetts has changed. It has not. Nothing has changed about our fair housing law in Massachusetts. We're also participating in other efforts to fill gaps. So, for example, the legislature passed the Protect Education Equity Bill this last year, and that law explicitly adds immigration status and disability to our education statutes in Massachusetts. Previously, they weren't included, but clearly covered under federal law, but just not articulated in our state statute. Now they are, so that is covered. And that law also prohibits schools from unreasonably punishing students for behavior related to their disability. So it's a really important law. So there's a lot of work going on, but I think calling back the, first answer I gave and your question, Jacqueline, we still have limited resources. So we're trying, we're issuing guidance, we're staying focused on our core work. We've expanded to do this federal work, but there's still a limited pool of resources.
Thank you. Stephen.
Well, like everyone else, we've been required to step up in a way that we didn't think was happening. I actually thought I was more on a retirement trajectory than on an active litigation trajectory, but times have changed. So CPR formed a national coalition of some of the leading disability organizations around the country: health law, aging, mental health, intellectual disabilities, ACLU. And we came together as what we call National Disability Rights Litigators Group. And our whole idea was to form a rapid response team that could move quickly to enter any of the spaces that I mentioned before. So, for instance, on the attack on federal rights, we first organized and did outreach to the disability community, told them about that case I mentioned where 19 states led by Texas, brought a case against to stop the new 504 regulations. We organized families in Iowa who did a demonstration at the AG's office in Iowa saying, do you really want to be on the wrong side of special education? And we were able to get some attorney generals to withdraw from the case, and ultimately about half of them sort of struck a deal with the federal government to step out of the case altogether. So the case is now being continued by Texas and 8 other states, and our National Disability Rights Group, the NDRL, it has organized amici briefs and potential interveners on behalf of paralyzed veterans, folks with hearing impairments, blind, spinal injuries, mental health, intellectual disabilities. All of those national organizations, Mental Health America, NAMI, the ARC, are all amici groups that will be part of one big brief. We have approximately 40 to 60 former state officials who have stepped up to be part of another brief, and we have a number of other legal organizations. So we'll be filing briefs in Texas to try to stop Texas's effort to eliminate Section 504. We're doing the same thing in Massachusetts with respect to those executive orders that I mentioned, particularly the executive order order around homelessness and the efforts to try to institutionalize veterans who have mental illness and put them in state hospitals. So we're going to be trying to represent them in guardianship proceedings, telling the local state court judge, don't appoint a guardian. Think about a supported decision-making model, which is allowed in our courts. Third, with respect to the attack on disability programs, we've partnered with Attorney General Campbell, Attorney General James in New York, who have brought cases under a federal statute that was passed in the 1990s and tried to identify when public benefits would be available to non-citizens. The Department of Justice, Department of Labor, and HHS have tried to dramatically broaden the scope of who is excluded from public benefits, saying that anyone who's not a citizen can't get help getting a job from the Department of Labor and work training programs, can't get help from mental health community centers if they have a crisis, can't get help from programs that provide support to people who are unhoused. And they've required those programs to be able to show and document citizenship, which of course, even many citizens won't be able to meet that test. So we've joined as a friend of the court in the Attorney General's brief in Rhode Island to try to stop the federal government from eliminating public benefits from other non-citizens. And finally, when DOJ's walked away from cases, we've walked into them. And so we've tried to come in behind DOJ in Maine. We formed a coalition of the ACLU and the Protection and Advocacy Group in Maine, and we've intervened in that case as the Coalition of Disability Advocates, and to try to preserve the settlement agreement, since DOJ doesn't care about its own agreement, and someone has to defend the kids and make sure that they're not abandoned. We've also organized all the behavioral health providers and peer groups in Louisville to work with the mayor, provide technical assistance and support about how you make a consent decree work, how you participate on a grassroots level, how you can have lawyers on a legal level, come together with the mayor as the administrator of the settlement agreement and try to make the changes that consent decree promised, but DOJ walked away from. So in each of those spaces, I think we've tried to take over where DOJ has said goodbye. We've tried to take over where the federal government has said, no, thank you. We're going to cut services from immigrants. And we've tried to take over when a number of conservative attorney generals have tried to launch a wholesale attack on disability rights.
Thank you. Keith.
So in terms of how we've protected past gains, we did a lot of work on our human rights apparatus that is part of our behavioral health and behavioral health residential service lines. The way it used to operate, a staff person who works in a group home is assigned to be the human rights officer for that group home. There's a built-in conflict of interest there. That person may have to file complaints against their supervisor or against their colleagues with whom they might be friends. It doesn't seem like it has a lot of integrity to it. So we decided that the members of the peer support team that work in behavioral health residential and behavioral health programs would function as the human rights officers for those programs, because they don't report to the supervisors in those programs. They report to a centralized team, the peer support team. We did that to eliminate the conflict of interest. We did that so that we could begin encouraging people living in these programs to start seeing kind of how they're treated through this human rights lens, and encouraging people to file complaints. In the years before we made this change, this won't surprise anybody, there were very few human rights complaints actually filed on the staff that actually made it to the Department of Mental Health and to like our own internal investigations team. I think most of them would get screened out internally by the person who works in the program. Now, when we made that change, we saw a drastic increase in the number of complaints, which we took to be a good thing. I think it meant that, people were actually starting to see the way that they're being treated through this human rights lens. And when they had questions about whether it was okay to be treated that way, they reached out to that peer specialist slash human rights officer and they filed a complaint. And we've used that as sort of a platform to talk about advocacy, self-advocacy, people being more involved in things that are going to have a potential impact on the quality of their lives, things like pending legislation. Um, we currently are following 52 pieces of, legislation bills that are in various stages at the State House. It's a really labor-intensive um, task. It's really hard to stay on top of kind of where in the process is any bill that we're interested in. We actually assigned a person on the peer support team just to submit a report every couple of weeks about the status of these bills so that then the peer support team could take that information back to the programs that they're in and have those conversations either one-to-one with, the individuals that they're supporting or in a community meeting or in a staff meeting so that the information about things that people might have an interest in are actually getting to them. And then we're offering them opportunities and support to take some action, whether they want to write a letter, submit an email, make a phone call. We'll sit with people and do that. And there's a number of, pieces of legislation that people are very interested in and concerned about, one of which is this, I think it's House Bill 5406. They want to create a registry of violent and dangerous mentally ill people. That sounds like a great idea. Like those are the kinds of things that we want people we support to know about so that they can get active if they choose, and we can support them to be active, to push back, to call their state rep, to call their state senator, to call committee members, that kind of thing. And we found that sort of in terms of self-advocacy support, we run some groups. We haven't found those to be particularly effective. People like them, but in terms of working with folks to develop self-advocacy skills, we found kind of the one-to-one work actually where people are, whether it's in their apartment or in their group home or out someplace in the community, to be a more effective strategy for helping people develop some skills and some interest in being a part of pushing back on some of the stuff that's going to negatively impact the quality of their lives. We developed a training called Intentional Care, along with a set of performance standards. The whole idea, we spent 10 years developing that with Dr. Patricia Deegan, who herself is a psychiatric survivor and a psychologist. And it's really a guidebook, manualized on how to work in our programs in a way that supports people's recovery process, their agency, their autonomy, and respects their privacy and confidentiality. We've been rolling that out again. We sort of stopped doing that training for a number of years. When the pandemic hit, we weren't able to kind of hold those trainings. It's been a slow process to get that sort of back up and running again, but it is up and running now, and we're starting to train our staff in intentional care performance standards, again, with this idea of this is how we want you to be working in programs. These are the things we want you to be paying attention to. And there are things like, confidentiality. We have a standard that talks about need to know, rather than a clinician sharing information about 8 people in a group home with 255 other residential staff. They're required to share it with as few people as humanly possible. Only those folks who need to know that information to be able to do their jobs effectively. And so in that way, people start to become more respectful of folks' privacy and confidentiality. We have a standard on respectful communication. We talk about not using pathologizing or diagnostic language or slurs to refer to people and their experiences. So we're hopeful that that is going to help us with our direct support staff to be able to have them working in ways that respect the autonomy and agency and the rights of the people that we support, and to support them in ways that allow them to choose their own path forward. Right. So that's another thing we're doing to try to kind of hang on to, some of the gains that people have experienced in the past. But it's a daily challenge. I mean, folks' motivation is problematic. Folks become fairly hopeless, based on some of the things that they're hearing in the news and they're seeing in papers and online. Um, People are more isolated than they've ever been. Um, we're working really hard. We started a program called Project Peach, was providing equal access through computers at home. We would refurbish used computers and get them out to people that we support who couldn't afford their own. We moved from that to a grant-funded program with a tech navigator where we were able to distribute about 300 tablets and Chromebooks to people we support. And this person, the tech navigator, was providing tech support to folks, like how to get on the internet, how to deal with viruses, that kind of stuff. But also encouraging people to now use these devices to connect to meetings that we're operating. We have virtual peer support meetings that we operate every single day that have international participation. We have people who log in from Japan and the Philippines and Mexico and Canada. And we're trying to, again, now that folks have tablets and Chromebooks to use, we're trying to get more of the people that we support residentially to start tapping into those virtual peer support groups. So these are the things that we're doing to try to hang on to kind of the work that we had, invested 20 or 30 years in that now seems under threat and under attack. Yeah.
We have about 10 minutes left before questions. And so I just want to cover two more things really quickly. If we could maybe talk about some grassroots solutions. So what type of advocacy works in this environment, or how can organizations and individuals actually be effective right now? And then if you could talk about, how do you stay motivated in this? Maybe just to wrap up, and then we'll move on to questions. So I'll go with Anne.
So to kind of call back to what Keith was saying about following legislation, contacting people, getting involved, going to hearings, I can't emphasize enough how important it is for the public to contact our office. This is how we understand what's going on for people that we serve, and we understand what they want from us. Unless you're contacting us, it is very hard for us to intuit that. And I assume it's the same for our state legislators and our other local government officials. So folks can always reach out to me to discuss disability rights matters. If I'm the wrong person, I'll try to find the right person in or out of the office. Folks can file a civil rights complaint on our website. We also accept a whole host of other complaints, health insurance complaints, consumer complaints. So there are resources there for a lot of different things that folks could need help with. We also just launched a federal action story collection form. And this is meant to build an archive of stories so we can again learn about what's happening and potentially use these stories to illustrate what's happening in litigation or in other messaging. And even more recently, we launched with Governor Healy a portal to report ICE and other federal misconduct. And again, the goal of this is to identify patterns and practices of misconduct so we know what's happening, and that can inform any legal or policy actions we'll take. So that is super important from our perspective. Hearing from people is very motivating within our office. On the sustaining hope question, I will say that I feel lucky every day that my job is to literally try to move civil rights forward. That's what I get to do, 37.5 hours a week. So even when things feel overwhelming, it gives me a purpose, even if it's a small thing every day, to focus on what we can do in our state and our local communities. I try to remember that history is full of dark and hard times for all sorts of people. When I listened to the 1619 Project several years ago now, Nicole Hannah-Jones talked a lot. She told a story about her dad flying the US flag, which she initially didn't understand. I'm not going to do her discussion justice, but what I remember from it and think a lot about, is that part of this discussion was pointing out that the United States has always been a project of pushing towards this more perfect union. It's never been perfect. We've been pushing towards a more perfect union. And this project has, I won't say always, but often, almost always, it's been advanced by folks who were not experiencing the best of what we had to offer as a community. Yet, despite that, they were really committed to the promise of our nation. And I think that that is really hopeful. And I see that in my cases every day. I'm working right now with a housing discrimination complainant. Who is just so incredibly brave, and pursuing her claim is incredibly emotionally demanding. But she insists on doing it because she wants to help other people in her situation who need accommodations for mental health disabilities. And I think that she is another real life example of someone committed to the promise of our nation and moving the needle forward.
So much for that. Stephen.
Well, I think we've probably gone over a little bit of the strategies that, we found to be effective. Litigation is clearly one. The attorney generals have done an amazing job. I think I don't know how many cases Attorney General Campbell's been involved in, but I'll bet it's way north of 50 and getting close to 100. And they're winning, a good part of them. The same thing is true of Democracy Forward and our National Disability Rights Litigators Group, et cetera. So while it's a long, slow litigation process, um, it, the courts by very nature are, designed to protect basic rights. And most of the judges, particularly the judges that are willing to stand up in the states where we're filing, have been courageous. They've been amazing. They've been timely. They stay up on weekends and write long opinions. And I think they're clearly on our side. A second area is community outreach and education. When the 19 states sued to try to block the Section 504 rules, we eventually, it took us a little while to do this together, but we eventually put on a webinar just to inform the community what was at stake. The webinar had 3,300 people on it. And it was, it almost stopped the technology from working because there were so many people interested in what it would mean for them, and it wasn't just um, advocates are, used to attending webinars, but it was moms and caretakers and people who were worried about what was going to happen to their loved ones. And I think the third area is voting. It's ultimately, there's another election. We got in this problem because of an election. And I think we're going to get out of it because of election. We're organizing the residents of a state hospital in Connecticut to try to make sure they have the right to vote. One of my very first cases that I did almost 50 years ago was to and organize a voting campaign at the Northampton State Hospital. And we got the person who was running was the district attorney, because the district attorney was in charge of bringing commitment petitions to lock people up. And so we thought, what better case than to have a voting rights outreach program at the Northampton State Hospital, invite all the candidates who are running for the district attorney to come and talk to the people who are going to be on the other side of their cases to tell them what they believed about civil rights and what they believed about criminal justice and what kind of DA they plan to be. And so I think that's the place that we're going to stand. That's also the place that gives me hope. Um, uh, this is not the first time that our government has turned against us or turned against people from different nationalities or people with disabilities or anything else like that. And probably it won't be the last time, but there'll be another time in which they're on our side when we are walking together. And so I really have a lot of hope that that's coming in the not too distant future.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And Keith.
I admire your optimism, Stephen. Yeah, it's not the first administration, but it's the cruelest.
Yeah.
In my opinion. It's the most, yeah. So what are we doing? I mean, voting is something that we always focus on. Again, trying to get people to exercise what power they actually have. So all of our HROs slash peer specialists in our group homes and in outreach programs are making sure that people are registered and offering to assist people to get registered. Um, we will probably organize an event where we bring folks in to kind of rally some enthusiasm um, for the upcoming elections. What else are we doing? We continue to do a lot of kind of one-to-one work around self-advocacy skills, encouraging people to kind of make their voices known. We're trying to get services to sort of voluntarily surrender some of their power and put some power into the hands of the people that we serve through things like electronic visit verification so that we know the people that we support are being seen and being helped in the way that they want and need to be helped, and that they have the authority to kind of sign off on that to ensure that that service is actually being provided, which is something that's come into question in the last couple of years. Um, Offering open dialogue. We've invested a lot here at Advocates in open dialogue training and the ability to provide this different way of working with families in particular, but also individuals that's much more humanistic, and provides space for more than just one person to be fixed, as though that were really the intention. It's really about understanding the experience from that person's perspective and understanding the experience from the perspective of people who are important to that person. So we're doing all of these things to try to put more control and power into the hands of people that we serve, and then providing some encouragement and support for them to use that power to the extent that they want to do it. Um, in terms of how to remain hopeful, it's a tough one. Um, it's a tough one. I'm coming up on turning 65 soon, and I kind of look back at the last 40 years and wonder, like, what have we actually changed? It's tough. I'm not a big believer in group homes. I've watched over the course of my career at Advocates, I've watched people come into a group home at age 22 and then die in the same group home at age 57. What does that say about how we're treating people and how we're helping people move their lives forward? And yet, necessity being the mother of invention, there are opportunities to work with people who've created solutions to problems that didn't previously exist, and they got their own funding. So we're working with a group of women, family members who've had adult family members who've struggled with their own mental health. They decided that force and coercion was not the right path, that that was not helpful to them as family members or to the person that they care and love. And so they got their own money, and then they proposed kind of this peer support program, peer support for the family, while we attempt to engage with peer support this person who's kind of out there doing their own thing. Um, that makes me really hopeful that there are people out there going, you know what, that stuff doesn't work. Let's stop pounding square pegs into round holes, and let's come up with some creative solutions, and let's find our own money. It's incredibly liberating. It's incredibly exciting. And I think, in these very difficult times, there are opportunities for motivated people to create new things that will work better moving forward than the things that we have done and tried before. So that's kind of where I get my hope right now.
Thank you. And thank all three. I'm so thankful for all three of you. I think this has been a fantastic panel. And I just want to give 10 minutes for some questions that we've gotten. And then, yeah, we'll wrap up. So I want to start with Keith. It kind of goes off of what you were talking about. So I want to go with you. This is specifically a question for you. What are some of the most helpful ways for family members to support group home staff in supporting our loved ones, even if our loved ones understandably want clear boundaries between the staff and their families?
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, if there are family members who are involved, and their adult children that we support residentially are okay with that. If families have gotten involved in terms of volunteering, bringing food to the house, those kinds of things. We actually have a family partner on our peer support team. That position is really a sort of lived experience of navigating or attempting to navigate the system on behalf of an adult child. Um, we can offer people, family members, that kind of support. I mean, I think just kind of understanding what direct support staff are up against in their day-to-day work, given how much they're compensated, what they're expected to do, what they're somehow expected to be able to do, keep people off the front page of the Boston Globe, it's an enormous amount of responsibility, and keep that in mind, and encourage and, support the staff any way that you can. And if you need support for yourself, reach out for that, because we can provide that as well. It doesn't have to be connected to whatever's going on with your family member that we support. It could be completely separate and just for you and your family members, whomever you want those people to be.
Thank you. Next question is, this is for everybody, any suggestions on how to convey these concerns to the media at the local and national level?
I think, first of all, the media is really interested in what's happening to people as a result of policies in Washington, the kinds of work we're trying to resist. And so I think the two ways to do it are with the stories of impact, and to talk about what's really happening. You may have seen over the weekend, through the stories of 5 or 6 unfortunate persons, survivors of people with mental illness in Idaho, who had catastrophic events because the legislature cut programs due to the proposed cuts that were coming from Washington. Several people died, and Idaho's Republican legislature, very Republican legislature, decided to restore the mental health programs for asserted community treatment in that state, to keep people alive and safe. And while some of the arguments were a little weird and not very person-centered, like this will actually save us more money rather than having them to go to hospitals or jails, the reality was, in the person-centered stories that the media had told and the impact of these cuts on people, it actually turned around the Senate and House of the Representatives, of the state of Idaho. And so I think the person-centered stories are important. And I think the other is the way and how we fight. Stories of the Attorney General's cases, of our cases, opposing DOJ walking out of Louisville. That became a front page story, that the Department of Justice was walking away from a settlement that took them a year and a half to negotiate to try to save people's lives. But there were other people walking back, were stepping up in their shoes. And whether those people are lawyers or behavioral health providers or peer advocates, seeing the courage, the media is really, I think, interested and willing to portray the courage of resistance.
Thank you. Next question, are there any big plans in any of your organizations to try to secure significant changes when the administration switches over in a few years? I think, when there is a new administration, whenever that may be. Is there any plan for your organizations about things that you're seeing, like, wow, we need more protection on this. We should have fought more on, on this issue, I think is what that person's trying to capture.
Well, as you mentioned, Jacqueline, it's going to take a while to rebuild what has been destroyed in Washington. But in the same way that a lot of really good lawyers left Washington and came to work in the States to work with Anne and others at the Attorney General's office, there'll probably be a bunch who will leave the States and go back to, work in Washington, which is a great source of and strategies for rebuilding. I think there's also going to be an awareness on the whole disability community that we can't take for granted what has happened to us in the past. We've had a long run of positive legislative reforms locally and nationally, positive Supreme Court cases, etc. We can't assume that's going to continue, and so we need to do our work and have different expectations and be prepared for the worst so that we're not surprised.
Anne or Keith, do you have anything to add to that?
I I can't say I can speak for the whole Attorney General's office on this
Yeah.
one. I will say that from where I sit, embedded in the Civil Rights Division, um, we haven't changed our mission all that much in response to the administration. Not sure if I'm saying it right, but we have stayed the course. And I imagine when and if we get different administrations, we'll continue to stay the course. We're still advocating for the draft legislation that we supported 2 years ago. We're supporting it now, and if it's not passed in 2 years, we'll be supporting it then. We are still, you know, so all that to say, there may be big plans that I'm not aware of, but I think in the Civil Rights Division, we have really tried this time to stay the course despite the increased workload to protect what we have. And I imagine that will mean that, we will be better postured to continue staying the course when we move into different political environments.
One other question too is, and this touched, Stephen, you touched on it a little bit of, we don't really have anyone, at least at the federal level, we don't have anyone who's in Washington really fighting for us, with us. So what do you all think that people outside of the mental health disability space need to understand that they don't? That is preventing this buy-in or partnership or whatever else.
Hmm.
Well, I think like any other attack on the people recognize that previous distinctions between disability, immigration, religious, gender identities, et cetera, like that, don't make a whit of difference when they're coming after us. And so I think it's been remarkable that disability advocates and attorney generals have been standing up for people who are not citizens. And there's a coming together, an intersection, and the intersection at some level is about devalued people who are not considered privileged, not considered a priority, not considered at the moment to have power. And I think we're finding a commonality amongst us that we didn't before. This actually happened in the disability movement back in the late 80s and 90s, when it used to be that there was a intellectual disability movement and a mental health movement and a physical disability movement, and they all came together because the ADA was about disability. And now civil rights is about all of us.
I think there was a comedian, I'm not going to remember his name, who said something like, the disability community is the only minority community that you can be a member of at any moment in time. So it's kind of like, they came for the communists. I think if you don't think eventually they'll come for you, if you're at all different, perhaps you should kind of think about that a little bit.
Well, thank you so much. I think this was a great panel, but I'm very appreciative to the expertise of our three panelists and the work and social justice initiatives that you all take part in every day. And that gives me hope, because working with people like all of you truly, truly is what's going to keep us going, unfortunately. But I'm so thankful for you all. I'm thankful for this panel, and I hope that everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks, Jacqueline.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.